Hello, it's John Heaton, and I was trying to think which solo Beatles albums I hadn't reviewed, and there's not too many, of which I have on vinyl, and I always like to have the vinyl before I review an album. And I realised I hadn't reviewed this one, which is John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, or actually credited just to the Plastic Ono Band live piece Toronto 1969. It was a number 10 hit in the US and it failed to chart in the UK, which is interesting. It originally came with a 13-month calendar, which I haven't got. I don't think I've ever seen that one. Maybe Fit to be Tie-Dye, that you've got a copy, Paul, but which you may, it would be good if you showed on, maybe you have, I can't remember. But I guess a copy with the calendar is worth a small fortune. So the band is a hastily assembled band. So what happened is that John was asked to be the compere at a rock and roll revival show in Toronto, September '69, where various artists like Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard and Carl Perkins, I think, were going to perform, and I think the Doors, and Lennon was asked to be the kind of overall compere, and he said, well, better than that, can I perform? And so the organisers said, yeah, sure, but he didn't have much time. So he had to get together a band pretty quickly, and apparently he asked George Harrison to play guitar, and George declined, which is interesting. I guess he didn't want to play the stuff with Yoko, and I guess relations were a bit strained between all the four Beatles around this time, because the single Cold Turkey, which Lennon recorded around this time, which was performed live here for the first time, he actually had asked the Beatles to lay down as a new single. And so, you know, all the talk about Lennon splitting and, leaving the Beatles around this period is a little bit fluid, because he asked the Beatles to record Cold Turkey and Paul declined. I'm not sure what the others said. Maybe they didn't think the lyric matter was appropriate for a Beatles single. But interesting to imagine if that had been a Beatles single, with Paul on bass and stuff. George on guitar would have been very interesting. As it happens, Ringo was on drums, and he got Eric Clapton to help out on guitar, and Eric Clapton helps out here. Literally grabbed at very short notice, told to get to the airport ASAP. Alan White on drums, who would later drum on Instant Karma and Imagine, the Imagine album. And then the faithful Klaus Voormann on bass, who had been in Manfred Mann's band on bass, and they knew from Hamburg, and he'd also drawn the front cover of Revolver, and he would do the drawing, the lithographs for the Ringo album in '73. So, and go on to play bass with John and George on most of their solo stuff in the early mid-'70s. So that was Klaus. And then the album is on the trusty Apple label, which looks great as always. This is my son's copy. I'm not sure if this is a UK pressing or I think this is a US pressing, but it erroneously says manufactured in the UK. Or maybe it was manufactured in the UK, but obviously it was recorded in Canada at this Peace Festival, and it's linked to that Peace campaign because they performed Give Peace a Chance at the concert, and apparently during that number everyone lit candles, and at the time that was fairly unusual. So apparently the atmosphere was great at this concert. There is a DVD, which I'm not sure if I picked up. It's a semi-official release. It's called Sweet Toronto, which has footage of the concert, and actually you can find it on YouTube, I think. A heavily bearded John belting out these rockers, and it's not the most polished performance under the sun, because they hadn't rehearsed, and they actually rehearsed on the plane, or tried to, and John was very nervous. First time he'd been out front playing live in front of an audience since '66, and he'd actually played briefly at the the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus in December '68 with Eric on guitar. And they'd done Yer Blues there, but that didn't really count as a massive live audience. But notwithstanding the fact they hadn't had any rehearsal, I think they put in a damn spirited performance. And side one in particular of this album is very powerful. They open with Blue Suede Shoes. Well, it opens with a compere announcing the Plastic Ono Band. It doesn't mention Lennon by name, just says the Plastic Ono Band. Shouted about 3 or 4 times, and then they come on to a roar, and presumably the crowd know who the Plastic Ono Band is, because they'd had a number 2 hit single with Give Peace a Chance, and I think word had got round that it was John Lennon. So no need to introduce him by name, but that's the only time in his career where he's been announced as the Plastic Ono Band, I think. And then Lennon steps to the microphone and says, okay, we're going to just do numbers that we know because we never played together before. And then they launch into Blue Suede Shoes, the Carl Perkins number, and do a great version of that. And play this one loud and play the whole thing. I don't think the record says play loud like the Cold Turkey single does, but it might have done, because this album is not one to be listened to while you're doing the ironing or something. This rewards a good loud listen, in my opinion. Then we move into Money, the '63 Barrett Strong track covered on With the Beatles. Well, I'm not sure if he recorded his version in '63, but the Beatles version was '63, taken at a much faster tempo. This is slowed down to a kind of chugging rhythm. And I know quite a few of you out there don't think it's a very good version. I absolutely love it. I think it's of the time, this kind of tempo. It didn't need to be a fast song. I think the backing vocals on the Beatles version are not particularly essential to the song. I think it works well without them. And I think Lennon's singing it extremely well. And this is a really interesting version of Money. A lot heavier than the Beatles version. Although, a lot of you guys out there are going to say it's not a patch on the Beatles version. Well, you're entitled to your opinion. Then we've got Dizzy Miss Lizzie, which John, he probably chose this because he knew these kind of songs backwards, and they'd done this song for all those years in Hamburg and throughout the Beatles touring days. So he probably knew the lyrics back to front, didn't need to rehearse it too much. Eric similarly could pick up and play this kind of song quite effectively, as he does here. Great version. And Lennon's singing with a lot of passion and freedom, although apparently he was on junk and being sick before he came on, and full of shit, as he says in the Rolling Stone interview. So where are we? So we get to Yeah Blues, which they'd done at the Rock and Roll Circus with the Stones, where Clapton and Yoko. Mitch Mitchell was drumming on that occasion. So it's done pretty well. This is the track from the White Album, of course. It was the only Lennon-McCartney track featured. I'm presuming that it was credited to Lennon-McCartney on the sleeve, because the Beatles hadn't split up at this juncture. Yes, it's credited to Lennon-McCartney. And as we all know, even Give Peace a Chance was credited to Lennon-McCartney, because they had this boyhood agreement that even if the other didn't have anything to do with the song, that they would always credit the other. And that carried on up until, well, I guess this is the last time, Cold Turkey and Instant Karma were credited to Lennon on their own. Cold Turkey is next, a live version, fairly rough around the edges, not as effective as the single version, but a brave song to try and do. Not sure what the crowd made of this. It's a difficult song to perform. It's not that accessible if you don't know it, and I think the studio version packs a bigger punch with the amplified guitars and Ringo's drumming. This is a pretty good live version though, and Give Peace a Chance is a good version of a great song, and it works better than the single, I think, because it's got a heavier sound with electric guitar and a heavier drum sound. It's pretty successful, I think, and a very appropriate song for them to do. After all, the album is called Live Peace in Toronto. And then side 2, unfortunately, this is the downside, pun not intended. It's just got Yoko screaming her ad-lib stuff over a bunch of electric guitars. The band's having fun, but it's pretty hard to listen to. Don't worry, Kyoko. John, let's hope for peace. I think Karen Tyler pointed out that side one was far superior. I don't think it takes $1 million brain to work out that that's the case. I should think there are many copies of this album where side two has been well played and side two has hardly been touched, unfortunately. And I say that with all respect to Yoko, because she would go on to do some pretty decent stuff in later years, particularly her approximately infinite universe, parts of Feeling the Space, and her work on Double Fantasy I think is pretty accessible and more accessible and just more enjoyable for me anyway. Although, avant-garde fans out there probably like this early stuff, but I really can't abide it, or the unfinished music, or Two Virgins, really. So this album is kind of let down for me by that. And at the time, the record company didn't really want to put it out. And John Lennon says very bitterly in the Rolling Stone interview, the record company Capitol were on the McCartney bandwagon, and I was just an idiot pissing about with a Japanese broad. And the music we were making, like Toronto, they didn't want to put it out because they didn't like that. Okay, well, maybe that's the case, but they did put it out and it did go gold. Carl Perkins was at the concert and came up to John afterwards and said, "You were so beautiful, you made me cry." Apparently Yoko's singing was more prominent on the John songs, and John mixed most of them out when he got back to Abbey Road, probably sensibly. And also Eric Clapton's backing vocals were mixed out of the mix. But this is a very interesting album because it was a very uncertain time for John. The Beatles were about to split unofficially, but as we know, it would take 9 months for that split to become public. And I guess at the time he didn't really know what was happening with the future of the Beatles, but he knew he wanted to go and do stuff on his own with Yoko, and hence this album. So, thanks for watching, and this is an album worth checking out. I don't think it's been released on CD. I haven't seen it. Well, I think it was released, but I didn't pick it up. And I haven't seen it re-released on vinyl, but it's nice to have. It's an important part of the catalogue. Thanks for watching. See you next time.